Baruch Spinoza was a rationalist who lived from 1634 to 1677. He was born to a Jewish family in Spain initially and was persecuted as a child, and so he and his family moved to Amsterdam in the mid-17th century. He was raised by his uncle, who was a rabbi and was studious from a very early age. But the mainstream of religious thinkers shunned Spinoza because he claimed that there was a single substance only, and that substance was God. Now this meant that God was everything. God was the trees, the birds, the air, the stones. There was only a single substance. Here we see the home of Spinoza and the room where he studied during that period of time. Spinoza tried to achieve a deductive knowledge of reality, just like Descartes. He was interested in necessary knowledge, and he employed the method of geometry. Spinoza thought God was prior to everything else, and this is why he disagreed with Descartes, who began with a clear and distinct idea of himself. And we see in this little cartoon, it says, "Mais Monsieur Descartes, est-ce que vous avez mal à la glande pinéale?" And here he is referring to Descartes' discussion of how the mind and body interact. Descartes had said that there was a gland at the base of the brain, and that the perceptions were like little vibrations that the thought was able to detect through the pineal gland. And as we see in this cartoon, Spinoza says, I'm sure it's due to substance abuse. Philosophy, according to Spinoza, must formulate ideas about God first, since these would appropriately affect any conclusions concerning human nature. Since Spinoza identified God as the entire substance, and the only substance, everything in the cosmos was called Deus sive natura, and this means God or nature. He says that an attribute is that which an intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance, and we can know only two attributes, thought and extension. Now recall in the works of Descartes that thought and extension were not attributes, but were the substances of reality, the two substances of reality. And now we see Spinoza countering this, saying one substance of God with two attributes, thought and extension. Spinoza calls the world the modes of God's appearance. So here we have two aspects of reality. Natura naturans, which is God acting by the requirements of his nature, and natura naturata, everything which follows from the necessity of God's nature. And looking at the two systems side by side, we see Descartes and Spinoza both have God at the top of the hierarchy, but the finite substances of mind and body are the substances in Descartes' system, whereas there is an infinite substance in Spinoza's system that has finite attributes of mind and body. Now, attributes in Descartes' system were thought and extension, and the modes in Descartes' system for thought was affirmation, denial, understanding, and sensation. The modes of extension in Descartes' system was size, shape, location, and weight. But the modes of the world were affirmation, denial, understanding, sensation in Spinoza, and size, shape, location, and weight for the attribute of body in Spinoza's system. And it's interesting, if there's only one substance according to Spinoza, it must mean then that everything that we have is as it eternally must be. That is, there is no end or purpose or final cause, because if what we have is God and God is eternity, God is not going to change or move toward perfection. God is necessarily perfection. Now, how do we know this reality according to Spinoza? He says there are 3 levels of knowledge, and we move from the lowest to the highest. The more we understand the individual things we observe and see in nature, the more we understand God. So, the highest form of knowledge, then, is an intuition that grasps the whole system of nature, and we get there by using our scientific knowledge to understand the individual things. Our imagination, which is the lowest form of knowledge in Spinoza's system, are the ideas that are derived from sensation. Since there's only one substance and not 2, we have no mind-body problem that we have in Descartes' system, and that mind-body problem being, how can an infinite mind without corporeal length, breadth, and height interact with a world that does have extension, length, breadth, and height? How can something intangible interact with something that is solidity? This problem does not arise because the one substance is God, and God has 2 attributes of mind and body. Humanity is a finite version of God. Now, that does not mean we're free. If God is eternal, we're not God's creation that has free will to love Him or not, according to Spinoza. We do have a desire to persist in our own being, but that does not mean that that is free will. He calls that a conatus, a desire to thrive. What does it imply for values in Spinoza's system? Well, there has to be no intrinsic good or bad, because God is perfection. For if we call something good, we desire it, and bad if we dislike it. That's all that good and bad is either we like it or we don't. But intrinsically, ontologically, there is no good or bad. Morality consists in improving our knowledge by moving from the level of confused, inadequate ideas up to the highest level of intuition. This kind of knowledge, Spinoza says, necessarily arises from the intellectual love of God. Well, how do you think Spinoza accounts for sinfulness? He calls it a spiritual unhealthiness. He says excessive love of something which is subject to many variations and of which we can never be master is unhealthy. Now, this is saying that something like Augustine said. Remember, Augustine said that if we love ourselves, others, or the God's creation too much, we're subject to sin because we have our disordered desire. This is similar in that the finite attributes of God are the multiplicity variation of experience. And if we love those things too much, this would be unhealthy spiritually. But we, as the finite version of God, if we love God insofar as we understand Him to be eternal, this, Spinoza says, is the intellectual love of God.